2,000 years before the word anxiety appeared in any clinical manual, a former slave sat in a small room in Nicopolis and wrote down something that modern cognitive therapists would later reinvent almost word for word. Epictetus, writing in the 1st century AD, identified the root of human suffering with a precision that still unsettles. He did not call it anxiety. He called it the confusion between what is within our power and what is not, and he argued, in the Enchiridion, that nearly all mental suffering flows from that single error. This is not a coincidence of terminology. The Stoics were building, across several centuries and multiple thinkers, a comprehensive psychology of the mind under pressure. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, they were not writing self-help. They were writing philosophy in the original sense, a disciplined account of how to live correctly in full knowledge of what being human actually involves, including its fears. In this video, we will examine 5 specific practices the Stoics developed to confront what we now call anxiety, practices that were grounded in precise philosophical arguments, not temperament or wishful thinking. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. What makes this relevant today is not that the Stoics suffered differently than we do. It is that they suffered in ways we recognize entirely: political instability, mortality, loss of control, the dread of an uncertain future, and they left behind, in works like the Meditations, the Letters to Lucilius, and the Discourses, a set of answers that were tested not in comfortable theory but in the weight of actual lives. The first and most foundational practice the Stoics brought to anxiety was a distinction so clean and demanding that most people, on first encounter, resist it entirely. In the opening lines of the Enchiridion, Epictetus writes, "Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." This is not a passive resignation to fate. It is an aggressive reorientation of the mind toward what it can actually affect, because the Stoics understood that anxiety is almost never caused by a real and present danger, it is caused by the mind's relentless projection into circumstances it cannot govern. Epictetus was speaking from lived knowledge here, not from theory. As a slave under the Roman Empire, he had no legal control over his body, his location, or his daily circumstances, which is precisely what gives his argument its peculiar force. He observed that the anxiety which destroyed people around him was not produced by the conditions of their lives but by the judgment they applied to those conditions, and this is why the dichotomy of control is not merely practical advice but a philosophical claim about the structure of suffering itself. When the mind consistently attributes its distress to external circumstances, to what other people might do, to outcomes it cannot determine, to futures it cannot see, it enters a loop that has no natural terminus. The Stoics called this kind of misdirected judgment a passion in the technical sense, not an emotion that should be eliminated, but a cognitive error that generates disproportionate distress. Understanding this, Epictetus argued, is the beginning of genuine philosophical practice, because it means the work of calming anxiety is not the work of changing the world but the work of correcting one's own orientation toward it. This distinction is harder than it sounds, and the Stoics knew it. Marcus Aurelius returns to it repeatedly in the Meditations, written between roughly 161 and 180 AD, which means he found it necessary to remind himself of this principle throughout his reign, not because it was obvious, but because it required constant reapplication. What this reveals is that the first Stoic practice against anxiety is not a technique performed once but a discipline of continuous redirection, and yet it is only the beginning of their method. Because separating what is within our power from what is not still leaves unanswered a deeper question: what do we do with the fears that remain even after that distinction is made? The second Stoic practice is one that initially strikes modern readers as morbid, and that reaction is itself philosophically instructive. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in the letters around 65 AD, advises him to set aside time every day to imagine clearly the worst outcomes his life might produce: illness, poverty, exile, the death of those he loves. Let us prepare our minds, Seneca writes in letter 91, as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The practice has a Latin name that the Stoics and later commentators used, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and its logic is precise. Anxiety, the Stoics observed, operates largely on the implicit assumption that current goods are permanent, that health, security, affection, and stability are the natural and expected state of affairs, and that their loss would be catastrophic. This assumption is never argued for, it is simply the default posture of an unexamined mind, which is why the loss of even minor comforts can produce disproportionate distress. The premeditation of evils directly confronts this assumption by forcing the mind to encounter loss in imagination before it encounters it in fact, because the imagination, when exercised deliberately and honestly, tends to reveal that the catastrophe anticipated is survivable, or that it is not, in which case it falls under the category of things entirely beyond our control. This is not pessimism, and Seneca is careful about this point. It is the opposite of pessimism in a specific sense, it is a refusal to allow the mind to be ambushed by what is already inevitable. Marcus Aurelius employs the same practice in Meditations X.34, where he surveys figures from history, powerful emperors, famous philosophers, celebrated warriors, and notes that all of them are gone, that their anxieties about outcome proved to have been misplaced because the outcome arrived regardless, and that this is not a cause for despair but for a radical recalibration of what actually matters in the present moment. What the practice of premeditatio malorum produces, when sustained over time, is what the Stoics called apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense of indifference, but the absence of reactive, disproportionate passion. The mind that has genuinely reckoned with loss in advance does not become cold or detached, it becomes, in the Stoic account, more fully present to what it actually has, because it has stopped taking the present for granted. This is why Seneca insists in letter 24 that the person who has rehearsed disaster is never truly ambushed by it. And yet this practice of deliberate imagination raises a further complication, because imagining the worst is not the same as knowing how to act when it arrives, which is where the Stoics turn to a third and more active discipline. The third Stoic practice against anxiety is one that Marcus Aurelius returns to more frequently than almost any other in the Meditations, and it operates through a deliberate shift in perspective that is simultaneously intellectual and almost physical in its effect. In Meditations 7.9, Marcus writes, "Confine yourself to the present." In 9.30, he elaborates, "Look at the immensity of time behind you and before you. How small is the sliver you call your life?" The practice, sometimes described by later scholars as the view from above, involves consciously expanding the frame through which one perceives a given anxiety-producing situation, because anxiety almost invariably operates in a compressed temporal and spatial frame where the present problem fills the entire field of vision. This is not a mystical exercise. It has a precise cognitive mechanism. When the mind is saturated with a specific fear, the outcome of a negotiation, a damage to one's reputation, an uncertain illness, it treats that fear as the whole of reality, which is why Stoic practice deliberately introduces contrast, the vastness of time, the number of civilizations that have risen and collapsed, the observation, as Marcus makes explicitly in Meditations 6.15. That the Macedonian army of Alexander and the mule drivers who transported their supplies are equally gone and equally forgotten. The anxiety that seemed absolute in its urgency reveals itself, under this kind of scrutiny, to be a local and temporary disturbance in a process far larger than the self. Seneca makes the same move in On the Shortness of Life, written around 49 AD, when he argues that it is not that we have a short time to live but that we waste a great deal of it, and that anxiety is one of the primary mechanisms of that waste, because the mind in a state of fearful anticipation is neither in the present nor genuinely preparing for the future, it is suspended uselessly between them. The view from above restores the mind to the present by reducing the apparent scale of the feared outcome, not through denial, but through accurate proportion. Marcus practiced this, it appears, under conditions of genuine political and personal severity, military campaigns, the deaths of children, the management of an empire under plague, which means the practice was not developed as a philosophical exercise in comfort but as a tool for functioning under real pressure. What this third practice reveals, considered alongside the first two, is that the Stoics understood anxiety as having multiple components simultaneously, a confusion about control, an assumption about permanence, and a distortion of scale. Each practice addresses a different layer of the same condition, which is why Stoic philosophical training was understood not as the application of a single technique but as the cultivation of a comprehensive orientation. However, there is one more layer the Stoics identified that the first three practices do not directly address, the layer of language, and specifically the language the mind uses when it describes its own condition to itself. The fourth and fifth Stoic practices against anxiety converge on something that modern cognitive behavioral therapy would later formalize as cognitive restructuring, though the Stoics arrived at it through a philosophical argument about the nature of judgment rather than through clinical observation. Epictetus, in the Discourses 2.18, written down by his student Arrian around 108 AD, argues that every emotional state, including anxiety, is preceded by an impression, and that between the impression and the emotion there is a moment of assent, a moment in which the mind endorses the impression as true and significant. The discipline of assent is the practice of catching that moment and examining it before allowing it to pass unchallenged. This is more demanding than it sounds, because most mental life is not experienced as a sequence of explicit judgments but as an apparently automatic emotional weather. The Stoics did not deny this phenomenology. What they argued, and this is the philosophically significant claim, is that the automaticity is itself a habit, which means it can be interrupted and retrained, because habits are formed through repetition and dissolved through deliberate counter-practice. In Meditations 8.7, Marcus Aurelius writes, "Do not disturb yourself by picturing your life as a whole, do not assemble in your mind the many and varied troubles which have come to you in the past and will come again in the future, but ask yourself with regard to every present difficulty, what is there in this that is intolerable and beyond endurance?" This is not suppression of thought. It is interrogation of thought, the habit of demanding that the anxious impression justify itself before being endorsed. The fifth practice, closely related, is what Epictetus describes in Enchiridion 5 as the use of precise language against catastrophizing. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. When the mind says this is unbearable, the Stoic practice is to replace that formulation with an accurate one: this is difficult, or this is unwelcome, or this is outside my control, and to notice that the accurate formulation does not carry the same emotional weight as the catastrophized one. Seneca demonstrates this in letters 78 and 99 when discussing grief and physical illness, where he does not argue against the reality of pain but against the mind's tendency to add a commentary of permanent ruin to what is in fact a temporary and localized suffering. Taken together, these five practices, the dichotomy of control, the premeditation of evils, the view from above, the discipline of assent, and the precise reformulation of impression, constitute not a mood but a philosophy. They are practical precisely because they are philosophical, grounded in an account of what the mind is, how judgment works, and where the real work of a human life must be done. What makes this final layer most significant for the viewer today is that it places the locus of anxiety's resolution not in changed external circumstances, not in suppressed emotion, and not in improved fortune, but entirely within the jurisdiction of a trained and attentive mind, which means, in the Stoic account, it lies exactly where Epictetus began, within our power. What the Stoics built across these five practices is not a technique for feeling better but a philosophical account of why anxiety is, At its root, a cognitive error, a misdirection of judgment toward what cannot be controlled, toward a permanent present that does not exist, toward a scale of suffering the mind has inflated beyond what the facts can support. This is why their methods, redeveloped independently by cognitive psychology nearly 20 centuries later, retain their force. They address not the symptoms of anxiety but its structure. The practical implication for the viewer today is direct and demanding. The reduction of anxiety is not a project of external change or emotional suppression, but a discipline of accurate perception, sustained through practice, exactly as Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca lived it. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe and we will keep exploring why.